Hello, my name is Patrick Herstetter, and I am here with Michael Kim and Anthony Malaguti to discuss a macroeconomic debate that has persisted for decades in policymaking: to intervene or not to intervene. Some economists view the economy as inherently unstable. They argue that the economy experiences frequent shocks to aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Unless policymakers use monetary and fiscal policy to stabilize the economy, these shocks will lead to unnecessary and inefficient fluctuations in output, unemployment, and inflation. This is known as active policy and also shows how monetary and fiscal policy can prevent or soften recessions by responding to these shocks. Other economists view the economy as naturally stable and blame bad economic policies for the large and inefficient fluctuations we have sometimes experienced. They argue that economic policy should not try to fine-tune the economy. Under passive policy, the government should take a hands-off approach to macroeconomic policy. At first, this view may seem surprising. However, economic stabilization would be easy if the effects of policy were immediate. Economic policymakers face a problem of long lags, and the length of these lags are very difficult to predict. There are two different types of lags. Inside lag is the time between a shock to the economy and the policy action responding to that shock. This occurs because it takes time for policymakers first to recognize that a shock has occurred and then to put appropriate policies into effect. Outside lag is the time between a policy action and its influence on the economy. This lag occurs because policies do not immediately influence spending, income, and employment. Monetary policy has a much shorter inside lag than fiscal policy because a central bank can decide and implement a policy change in less than a day. Some policies called automatic stabilizers are designed to reduce the lags associated with stabilization policy. Automatic stabilizers are policies that stimulate or depress the economy when necessary without any deliberate policy change. One can view these automatic stabilizers as a type of fiscal policy without any inside lag. Successful stabilization policy requires the ability to accurately predict future economic conditions. One way forecasters look ahead is with leading indicators. A leading indicator is a data series that fluctuates in advance of the economy and can be used to identify recessions. Forecasters also use macroeconomic models that describe the economy quantitatively rather than just qualitatively. However, forecasts are not always accurate. For example, in Figure 18.1, the failure of forecasting during the Great Recession. The red line shows the actual unemployment rate from 2007 to 2010. The green line showed the unemployment rate predicted at various points in time. For each forecast, the symbols mark the current unemployment rate and the forecast for the subsequent 5 quarters. Note that the forecasters failed to predict the substantial rise in the unemployment rate.
Next, I will be talking about how expectations play a role in the economy. Economics is still a young science, meaning there is still a lot we have yet to discover or comprehend. Economists can never be completely confident when assessing the effects of certain policies, so they must be careful when offering policy advice. Economist Robert Lucas emphasizes that economists need to pay more attention to how people form expectations of the future. Expectations play a crucial role in the economy because they influence all sorts of behavior. For instance, households will decide how much to consume based on their expected future income, and firms decide how much to invest based on their expectations of future profitability. Lucas points out one important factor that influences these expectations, and that is the policies pursued by the government. Therefore, when policymakers try to evaluate the effects of any policy change, they must consider how people's expectations will respond to these changes. Lucas argues that traditional methods of policy evaluation, such as those that rely on standard macroeconomic models, do not adequately take into account the expectations of people. This criticism of traditional policy evaluation is known as the Lucas critique. The Lucas critique appears in the analysis of disinflation, a topic that will perpetually be important. The cost of reducing inflation is commonly measured by the sacrifice ratio, which is the number of percentage points of GDP that must be foregone in order to reduce inflation by 1 percentage point. But because estimates of the sacrifice ratio are often large, some economists argue that policymakers should learn to live with inflation rather than incur the large cost of reducing it. However, advocates of the rational expectations approach argue estimates of the sacrifice ratio are unreliable because they are subject to the Lucas critique. The sacrifice ratio is based on adaptive expectations, that is, on the assumption that expected inflation depends on past inflation. Although adaptive expectations may be a reasonable measurement in some circumstances, workers and firms setting wages and prices will rationally respond to policy changes by adjusting their expectations of inflation. This change in their expectations of inflation will affect the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Therefore, reducing inflation can potentially be less costly than suggested by traditional estimates of the sacrifice ratio. When deciding whether government should play an active or passive role in the economy, we consider the history of macroeconomic policies. Our review of stabilization policy should be influenced by whether policy has historically been stabilizing or destabilizing. So in other words, if a policy has successfully insulated the economy from large shocks in aggregate supply and demand, then the argument for active policy should be made. Conversely, if an economy that has experienced few large shocks in aggregate supply and demand can be traced back to inept economic policy, then passive policies may be implemented. Nevertheless, identifying the sources of economic fluctuations is not easy, so solely relying on historical success of policies is not entirely valid. A second topic debated among economists is whether economic policy should be conducted by rule or by discretion. This debate is distinct from the debate over passive versus active policy. Policy is conducted by rule if policymakers announce in advance how policy responds to various situations and commit themselves to following through on this announcement. Policy is conducted by discretion if policymakers are free to size up events as they occur and choose whatever policy they consider appropriate at the time. Some economists believe that economic policy is too important to be left to the discretion of policymakers. Some economists fear that politicians use macroeconomic policy to further their own electoral ends. For instance, a president might cause a recession soon after coming into office to lower inflation and then stimulate the economy as the next election approaches to lower unemployment. This would ensure that both inflation and unemployment are low on election day. This manipulation of the economy for electoral gain is called the political business cycle. Distrust of the political process leads some economists to advocate placing economic policy outside the realm of politics.
Finally, I will be discussing the time and consistency of discretionary policy and the rules for monetary policy. If we assume that we can trust our policymakers, discretion at first glance appears superior to a fixed policy rule. This policy is flexible. Intelligent policymakers gives no reason to deny changes on varying conditions. Time and consistency of the policy causes a problem with rules over discretion. If it's understood that policymakers may be inconsistent over time, private decision makers are led to distrust policy announcements, making them want to make a fixed policy rule. The ratio from Federal Reserve regarding unemployment and inflation is dependent on expected inflation. The Fed prefers people expecting low inflation, so it will have a favorable trade-off. To reduce the expected inflation, the Fed can announce monetary policy's goal is low inflation. Steady growth in money supply stabilizes aggregate demand only if the velocity of money is stable. The money supply also needs to be adjustable to shocks in the economy. The next rule is nominal GDP targeting. Nominal GDP targeting is where the Fed decides and announces a planned path for nominal GDP. If it rises above, then the Fed reduces money growth to lessen the aggregate demand. If it falls below it, then the Fed raises money growth to stimulate aggregate demand. Nominal GDP allows monetary policy to make adjustments. Inflation targeting is when the Fed will announce a low target for the inflation rate and adjust money supply when the actual inflation rate deviates from the target. Doing this insulates the economy from changes in the velocity of money. Advocates for this policy argue that a commitment to a fixed policy rule is necessary to solve the problem of time and consistency. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed.